We're very, very pleased to have, I was hoping that when I press this button, the slide would kind of go forward. That's the one. Yeah, that's what I was hoping would happen. Very, very pleased to have the most open source projects ever represented at AstriCon this year in the open source showcase. Asterisk, as you know, is the basis for AstriCon, but it's grown much wider than that. It's all about the open source community in general terms. And you'll notice specifically in there is a project called FreeSwitch. FreeSwitch was developed by some people that were involved in Asterisk a while ago. And we're very, very pleased to have them along. And at the time, there might have been some hard feelings around, but a lot of water has passed under the bridge and things have changed. And the FreeSwitch guys tweeted this tweet only yesterday. An excellent picture, by the way. Thought it was very, very nice indeed. And this was one of the responses. I don't know whether you can see it, but so I've redacted the name of the person who's lost in the old world. They said something naughty, but look at what the FreeSwitch guys replied. No, we're all on the same side, aren't we? And it's open source telephony. So let's give a round of applause for that, all on the same side. And of course that goes whether you're a Camaillio guy, an OpenSIPs guy, or whatever, we're all on that same side. Now, this is the first AstriCon gathering we've had since quite a momentous thing happened in the world of open source. Back before I was into Asterisk, I worked for a company called Aculab. They were like an English version of Dialogic, and we did telephony boards, and we were charging $10,000, $20,000 for these telephony boards. They had DSPs on that did all sorts of things. And one day, a little bit of a ripple went around the company, probably about 2002, 2003, saying, have you seen zapatatelefony.org? There's a guy there who's putting the bill of materials, the circuit diagrams, the Gerber files, and everything you need to build your own telephony card for under $1,000. And it frightened us a little bit. Very frightening. Of course, the man behind that project was, the cards were the Tormentor. Zapata was a Mexican revolutionary, and it was decided to call the cards the Tormentor cards because in Spanish, tormenta is a big storm. And the guy, this particular guy, Jim Dixon, knew that he was going to create a big storm. Sadly, Jim passed away earlier this year, and this is the first time we have an opportunity to pay tribute to him. And so I'd like to welcome Mark Spencer and Alison Smith up onto the stage to be part of that tribute.
So an interesting factoid about myself, I don't actually like speaking on the phone. It's ironic, I know. I record phone prompts, but I actually hate talking on the phone. So as diplomatically as I could, I suggested perhaps that he distill all of his thoughts about Canadians into a concise email and perhaps just send that to me every week. Which he did for a couple of months. Every week, this same email of hoser, just written in lines and lines and lines. So, you know, whenever anyone passes away, I always hope that they understand the impact that they had on us, no matter who they are. And in Jim's case, it's particularly true because, as Mark will outline, he was incredibly influential in our industry. Most of us would not be here without his contributions. So I will pass it on to Mark to fill in that idea. But dude, I miss you. This hoser misses you a great deal. Thanks.
So you guys all know Asterisk. I started back in 1999, and it required some interesting types of hardware at that time to be able to bring in any regular conventional telephone line. And voice over IP was still pretty new. SIP was still in the process of being standardized, even more so than it is still in the process of being standardized now. And one of my employees one day printed out this website, and he sat it on my desk with a little note that says, I have no idea what this is, but I thought you would find it interesting. And it was the Zapata Telephony website. And I looked at this. Jim had already put together the original ISA version of the Tormenta card, which only worked with maybe like 2 motherboards that were available even at that time. But I was amazed at how this technology could be paired with Asterisk. And so I called up Jim, and he goes, dude. And I said, dude? And he said, dude. And just sort of like Allison said, that was usually the first 5 minutes of any phone call with Jim, was just going dude back and forth. But eventually it sort of settled into a discussion of what needed to happen to take this technology and how it could be married with Asterisk to produce a system that would allow people to bring in telephony interfaces a lot less expensively than they were available in the past. And oh my gosh, here was an opportunity in which everything could be open sourced, all the way from the lowest level driver all the way to the top level. You could have a lot more control and not be constrained by the programming interfaces that were available from third-party vendors. Although Jim never really sought to monetize his work, in spite of many opportunities to do so, he certainly had a really incredible impact on the telecom industry at large, because the entire Zapata telephony, DADI, that whole block of technology is what made Asterisk have a different story. See, most people that were doing voice over IP at that time said, here's how you do voice over IP. You just rip everything you have in your whole company that you've invested hundreds of thousands of dollars in out, and then you put in our new system, and it's the greatest thing since sliced bread. And all of a sudden, with Asterisk, we could go in and say, you don't have to throw all that stuff out. Here are these low-cost interface cards, and you can just hook up to the existing phone system that you have, and you can start adding all these features incrementally on the side. And that was such a breakthrough that it allowed Asterisk to go into all these companies that might never have given it a chance otherwise. And just over time, it grew to be the thing that you would use, because why would you keep throwing more money into this old behemoth when you've got this experience working with Asterisk as your voicemail or as your conferencing server or whatever else, with your voice over IP lines hooked up to that as well. So anyway, we all, I think, owe a tremendous debt of gratitude to Jim Dixon, the dude. So let's all say dude and then give a round of applause. So, dude. Dude.
Thank you very much.
All right, I'll give back to you, David.
You can take that with you. Thank you. Okay, and that last picture, by the way, was Dude. By the way, it's a known fact amongst those that converse with Dude that not only did he spend the first 5 minutes of the phone call saying Dude a lot, but then once you got to the main body of the phone call, he was prone to drop the occasional F-bomb into the conversation, wasn't he, was Dude? Anyway, that's just one of his things. What I wanted to say, that last picture was of Dude and his museum of telephony curiosities, old AT chassis with very old ISA technology in that he used to bring along. And he used to do that whenever we did a show on the East Coast, on the West Coast, Dude would show up. So he's much missed and a great contribution. Anyway, that's Dude, and we've respected Dude, I think, in an appropriate way. So now it's time for me to introduce Digium's CEO, none other than Mr. Danny Wyndham. Please welcome him. Thank you, Danny.
Thanks, David. Good morning. Good morning. Good morning. Good morning. I want to be the next person to welcome you to AstriCon. It's not just AstriCon, it's AstriCon 14th time we've had this conference. And I'm interested to know if any of you have been at every AstriCon. Show of hands. Mark Spencer, Allison. It's interesting that Asterisk continues to garner new audience members, so I'd like to see a show of hands if this is your first AstriCon. Wow, welcome. Digium is the presenting sponsor of AstriCon, but there are lots of sponsors of AstriCon, and I'd like to encourage you to personally go by and visit them in the exhibit hall and thank them for their contribution to helping make AstriCon possible. It's my pleasure this morning to introduce our keynote speaker. Our keynote speaker is Dean Bubley. Dean is the founder of Disruptive Analysis. He's an independent tech industry analysis and consulting firm. He's an analyst and a futurist with over 25 years' experience, specializing in the areas of wireless, mobile, and telecom. He's one of the leading market observers covering network infrastructure and software provider business models, voice video communications, and telecom policy. He's promised to do about an hour on wireless spectrum allocation this morning. Just kidding. He's a visionary whose opinions are often seen as diverging from the consensus. So he sees himself as a contrarian. Among other topics, he's currently focused on the future of voice and video, AI, blockchain, and contextual communications. He advises on trends in telecom business models, mobile networks, IoT, along with telecom regulation. His clients include many of the world's largest telecom carriers and vendors, along with regulators and industry associations. Former associations of his include stints with Granville Baird, a UK research firm, Data Monitor, where he was chief analyst and director of consulting. He holds a BA in physics from Keble College, part of Oxford University. Please join me with a big AstriCon welcome to Dean Bubley.
Thanks, Danny. Good morning, and thanks for the extensive bio, which I'll gloss over for now. But suffice to say that I probably won't do an hour on spectrum policy, despite James in the front row probably wishing that I would. Could I have my slides up, please? So I'm going to be talking a little bit about the future. People who've seen me speak before have probably seen in this audience me talk about WebRTC or maybe unified comms, and I'll touch on those. But actually, I'm going to look a lot broader and with a further horizon. It struck me yesterday in one of the sessions I went into, the word future-proofing. And we can never be completely confident about what will happen. We know there's going to be a lot of change around communications. And we do need, as was said in the presentation yesterday, to focus on what's next. And I think hopefully over the next half an hour or so, I'll just sort of drop a few ideas and maybe hopefully catalyze some thoughts about ways in which communications will intersect with a whole range of other trends that are going on. I'll also try and pick out some things that I think are overhyped. As I was introduced, I do tend to see myself as a bit of a contrarian, so there's certainly areas where I don't buy into some of the enthusiasm. And sometimes it's just a timing thing, and sometimes there's something which fundamentally doesn't work. And I'll maybe cover a few of those. So I cover three areas. Communications, apps and services, as today is focused on. But I do a lot of work on the future of network technology. And that actually is quite important in a number of ways to communications. We sometimes take connectivity for granted. And I think that that works sometimes, but certainly and especially for mobile forms of communication, we sometimes need to be a little bit more pragmatic. And the other thing that I do is what I call telecom futurism. I meet a lot of futurists, and I meet a lot of people who understand telecoms. And what I tend to see is that sometimes people on the telecom side look at various future trends, perhaps too enthusiastically or without understanding the parameters they live in. And I also meet a lot of futurists who don't understand telecoms. And I try to sort of look at the intersection between the two. So I could stand here all day and talk about an awful lot of fun 10 to 15 year horizon things. And there's stuff that we probably see in TED Talks and Wired magazine and so on. And I could fill this slide 3 times over. And I've put a few things here. Obviously drones, self-driving vehicles, automation and robotics, whether that's to improve productivity or perhaps on the negative side to impact employment in the future, and that becomes political as well as technological. We talk about smart environments and energy, whether that's buildings or cities, residential homes and smart homes, or smart buildings and industrial. And I'll touch on some of that as I go through. AI is a huge topic, and even the way that AI meets telecoms is worthy of an entire day. In fact, if I wasn't here, the other event that I was asked to speak at this week was an AI and telecom conference in Kazakhstan. So I decided that much as though Almaty might have been an interesting city to visit, it would probably be to an audience listening through interpreters who perhaps might not get some of the telecoms nuances. So I'm very, very pleased to be here in Orlando instead. Incidentally, I understand this session is being live streamed. So as well as sort of thanking the organisers of AstriCon for putting me out live over the web, I'd also like to perhaps thank slightly less the people at AstriCon who are now watching this upstairs from their bedrooms rather than make it down to the ballroom at 9 in the morning. So hello guys, if you're up there, please do come down for the Q&A at the end. I don't know, I think we have a few Brits in the room. I listened to our Prime Minister give a speech this morning at her party conference, and she basically had a bit of an absolute nightmare because, firstly, she had a cough and a sore throat. She nearly couldn't make it through the speech. And secondly, she had someone come up in the middle of the presentation, so it was like a physical heckler giving her what in the US would be called a pink slip, or in the UK a P45. So frankly, compared to what she's gone through this morning, I'm pretty sure I'm going to have an easy ride here. So, other things that are going on. Human enhancement technology. And now, that doesn't really impact telecoms, you think, apart from the things around longevity. We might need to think about what is communications for someone who's 110 years old in the future, who may even still be in the workplace. What do we think about someone who perhaps has better or worse or different vision or hearing to a normal human? All of those are probably 10 to 15 years out. But then again, the sort of things which are interesting to think about from a communications point of view. And then the new dangers and risks is really important, and particularly around security and privacy, and I'll touch on those. One of the themes that I use a lot is this word intersection. And so we have all of these sort of vertical trends in technology. Some of them are IT and communications trends like AI or blockchain, and some of them are outside of our normal day-to-day visibility around, it could be smart cities, it could be biomedical. But what I'm noticing is that these intersect in all sorts of interesting ways, firstly with the network side of things, but also with communications, applications and services, voice, video, collaboration, messaging, contextual communications and so on. And for me, this is interesting because the opportunities are where multiple trends coincide and intersect. And I think that when you start thinking in this sort of matrix fashion of, well, what can we do with IoT and sensors combined with video? What can we do in terms of collaboration and machine learning? And actually, this is simplified. You can pretty much treat this as fractal. You click on any of those intersections and double click, and there's another matrix underneath it. And I'll go through one later on. Also, this is probably three-dimensional, four-dimensional, and actually the opportunities and the possibilities, the combinations are so huge that one of the advantages is that no one, not even a Google or a Facebook or an IBM or a Microsoft, can do all of the intersections between all of these different trends, which means that at least in theory, developers using the appropriate sort of tools and mindset and skills should be able to find unique sources of business for a long time. So I'm not going to talk about a lot of what the rest of the show covers. Things like minutes, a bit of a legacy reason of why we calculate phone calls in terms of minutes. Numbering, I'm not going to touch on that in too much detail, and that factors into identity. Contact centers, I will come back to later on in the sort of the AI and maybe sort of customer interaction in the future. And then there's things like roaming and international calls as well, which are really important topics, but are well covered elsewhere. So what I want to think about more is what's driving change or inhibiting it. And I think it's really important because, I mean, lots of people put up a slide of saying, these are the catalysts. Yeah, so there's going to be new sources of voice and video input and output. I'll cover those in a minute. There's going to be really cool signal processing we can do at the edge of the network or even in silicon. There's AI and machine learning. All of these are fantastic drivers of opportunity, whether that's for Asterisk, other open source projects, or indeed commercial products as well. But there's also some negatives and some breaks, and privacy and security. Privacy is a really huge one, particularly if you think about what you can do if you combine massive collection of voice or video or messaging data, perhaps in real time, with analytics and perhaps organizations or governments that perhaps are not quite as friendly as they might be. Regulations, unfortunately, are a part of all of our lives, and certainly in telecoms, whilst there's certain things we see are being deregulated, some of the trends that I'll talk about might bring in new regulations. There's things like in Europe, GDPR, the new privacy regulations coming in next year, for example. Platforms, and there's network abilities, but there's also network inabilities. And again, that's really important. We are currently 2 walls from the outside of the building, which is fine. Certainly for the wireless microphone is only going across the room here. But we talk about 5G, for example, and a lot of the 5G wireless networks are going to be running in spectrum, wireless spectrum comment, which doesn't go through walls very well, which means that if we create applications, maybe they won't work. And so we perhaps start to think about what the network can and can't do and where it can and can't do it. So what is this thing voice? We are used to talking about voice and phone calls as being the same thing. And one of my pitches is to try to sort of debunk that a bit. There's an awful lot more you can do with voice other than have an A to B call for X minutes. Obviously we have voice assistants like the Echo and Alexa. Singing. Is karaoke a voice application? Can be, if you want to think about it, through with perhaps stereo voice. I've heard some interesting things recently about, the far right here, inhale and exhale. A couple of companies are using recorded voice and changes in recorded voice over time as a biomarker of possible diseases. And they are working to find out whether you can predict or partly diagnose or at least give a warning for it could be cardiac problems, it could be Parkinson's disease, based on patterns in your voice, which is both really impressive from a telemedicine point of view and really scary from a privacy point of view. I did a research report earlier this year on data over sound, essentially using either audible or almost ultrasound signals to send low-rate data, perhaps within a room, rather than use Bluetooth or a wireless technology. And that's already been used in some collaboration systems, for example, to pair your phone with a digital whiteboard. And there's a lot of other use cases there. You can actually send those messages over a public address system, potentially, which actually, again, is a new form of, not quite voice, but it's audio. We're entering a new era of IP-based push-to-talk. Public safety networks are now being rolled out over both fixed-line voice over IP, but also wireless as well. There's a number of 4G-based public safety networks, including here in the US and in the UK. Video. Underneath video, and whether that's human communications or IoT communications, are image sensors. And so it's interesting to think about what's going on. I mean, if we had this conversation 10 years ago, there were very, very few. We had webcams 10, 20 years ago, early digital cameras. But really, what is making video such a big deal for the communications industry is the fact that there are now so many types, prices, capabilities, form factors of video sensor. You can't see it, but on the far right, that's an extract, a screenshot of an electronics website with 900 sorts of video sensor, different capabilities and prices. And similarly, there's a similar number of display capabilities and sizes. And this is really increasing the chance we can use for video communications in all sorts of products and systems. And that's only going to continue over time. And not only is it going to be static images or ordinary 2D video, but we're starting to get things like 360-degree cameras. I was in South Korea last week, and because they have the Winter Olympics coming up in early next year, they are doing an awful lot of 5G demos. And one of the interesting things I saw, I'm not sure if it's a first, but it's close to it if it isn't, was a real-time 360 camera transmission from one of these sort of 360 cams in a cafe 5 miles away to a sort of AR headset. So you'd look around and in real time have streamed 360 images up and down as well. And it was a bit low, the frame rate was a bit low, and it wasn't quite perfectly stitched together, the images from the different cameras, but it was quite impressive, particularly because the last sort of few meters of it were over wireless rather than with a cord. And I think we can expect to see a lot more of that. Not only that, but we're going to start seeing a redefinition, not just of what audio means and voice, but a redefinition of video as well. It's interesting, I originally did this slide a couple of months ago, and since then we've seen 3D imaging. And apologies if I'm standing in front of the words on this side of the screen. 3D imaging in face recognition in the new iPhone, but there's a lot of other capabilities where that's going to emerge, and so that's going to start to redefine our thoughts on what is video, and also therefore from a communications point of view, how we manage that, how we transmit it, how we store it, how we process it, what the user interface implications are going to be. Infrared might be another. There's a lot of interest as well in analytics, real time of emotions, whether that's video or audio. What can you tell from where someone is looking? So eye tracking, for example, in combination with a conferencing or collaboration tool, could allow people to measure attention and optimize the way they give conference speeches or collaboration, video webinars, for example. What would be really good right now is if I had a live, next to the clock, I had an attentionometer, which is looking at people in the room, and I could tell when I should move on to the next slide and what percentage of the room is looking down at their phone. There's all sorts of ways we can start to integrate new bits of technology, and microscopy as well. So when we think about the Internet of Things, and I know it gets talked about probably too much, it's worth realizing that this is a hugely sort of fragmented area. You've got lots of sort of different industries and sectors, everything from agriculture to industrial. There's a lot of interest around in-vehicle systems, whether that's emergency calling. The EU now has a regulation called eCall, which means cars need to call automatically 911 or 112. Wearables, cities, drones, all of these things intersect with our normal day-to-day views of what communications, applications and services are in interesting and unpredictable ways. And again, you can then layer on AI to this and a number of other trends. So to give an example, I see an awful lot of work being done at the moment on drones, and particularly for things like inspection or in agriculture, public safety, maintenance of machinery, if you're, I don't know, running an oil refinery, for example. But actually, it's rather than just thinking, oh, it's a drone with a camera, is realizing the interaction and communication flows behind that. And often you'll have an operator of the drone, who perhaps is close by, but in future may well be miles away if the regulations permit. But then you might also have some sort of subject matter expert who understands irrigation in fields or rust on valves on oil pipelines, or is actually the person commissioning that act of inspection. It could be an architect looking at the construction of a building. And so you may well find that obviously the drone operator needs video to actually fly the thing, with control going the other way. But actually, the drone operator does not want to see video of the person. That would be too distracting. So there's probably going to be a voice session going on between the two of them, along with the video, which is probably being passed through. And there's 101 new sorts of sort of interaction model where you record stuff, where you have analytics, whether there's a fourth party involved, I don't know, a local safety expert or something. And we're going to see this in everything from sort of sports training to entertainment. all sorts of maintenance. Public safety, you may find that not only does the drone have a camera, it might have a wireless or Wi-Fi small cell on it as well, so that a firefighter inside a building may well have an AR headset where they're getting good connectivity and stream both voice instructions, and maybe it's a smoke-filled room, but the AR is superimposing the blueprint of the building or something like that. So there's going to be all sorts of interesting hybrids of voice, video, 3D, AR and VR. So when I break this down, I see three essential intersection methods between IoT and communications. I think the easiest to grasp is a new endpoint, which is voice-enabled. It could be a vehicle, or it could be a healthcare device. That's actually I think it's a blood pressure cuff. It could be a street-side terminal. There's a number being rolled out in New York and London by this same company. It could be important bits of infrastructure. I put fire control panel in there, and that would bring with it all sorts of additional regulatory burdens as well as capabilities. So I think that the new devices are easy to understand, that there are going to be, everything is pretty much going to have either a camera or a microphone in it, or a display or a speaker. Then there's this sort of where you start adding in machine learning and analytics. And so one of the things that I'm starting to see is capturing data from, could be sensors in a jet turbine. It could be in a room where you're counting the number of people in the room, all sorts of things. But on some occasions, those analytics from that, whether that's real time or with a database, are going to be used to sort of either trigger or inform a conference. It could be a sales call, it could be a maintenance call, it could be to set that up, it could be to give the person who is the engineer and their supervisor and the supplier information on the history of that particular product and when it failed last. And I think that is a really interesting set of possibilities for communications developers and service providers. So you can imagine, say an elevator. 60% of the reason that elevators go wrong is because of the doors, which are obviously checked periodically. But if you have an accelerometer on the doors and you realize that this week they're closing a little bit slower than last week or the week before, you could basically send the engineer out and schedule a time for the engineer a month ahead of the normal servicing period to try to sort of do what's called preventative maintenance. I read something which suggested that potentially if you could fix everything in the world before it goes wrong rather than after, you could add about 2 or 3% to global GDP. The last one is not as obvious, and this is where IoT could improve the performance and functionality of voice or video applications. And that's where you perhaps are realizing that you have the temperature sensor in a room like this, which then makes you realize that perhaps actually for the optimum concentration, you want to maybe lower the temperature a couple of degrees in the room. I would love to have something in my Fitbit which measures my speech cadence and just buzzes gently to tell me if I'm talking too fast so that I slow down. It could be the robot or the sort of drone or with wheels which sort of acts as a sort of remote video conferencing terminal and various other permutations. And yeah, I think we need to think as a voice and video industry of how can IoT improve what we're doing as well as how can we improve what they're doing. Blockchain. Right, again, I could speak for a long period of time on blockchain. Blockchain is the distributed consensus mechanism underneath Bitcoin, and there are now also multiple other blockchain approaches which essentially decentralize. It's a distributed ledger. It decentralizes information and potentially also is a platform for what are called smart contracts, where you have essentially computational law, where the interaction between multiple parties or devices comes up with automated outcomes with the software. It could be triggering a payment, it could be triggering a call, is an inherent part of the software contract from that distributed ledger. There's lots of possible ways in which blockchain may, and I stress may because this is one of those areas that is massively overhyped at the moment, may intersect with the telecoms industry and communications users. The one I want to focus on is what's called data integrity protection. We're used to talking about things like fake news at the moment, but what I want to really worry about is fake everything. Imagine in a couple of years' time, you get a call, and it's your bank saying, Mr. Bubley, that loan you discussed with us last week, we've agreed it, and the interest rate is 732%. I'll be like, what are you talking about? Well, here's the recording. What recording? The recording of you agreeing to the loan. We have an issue when you blend voice technologies with AI of fake voice recordings or fake video recordings, for example. This is just one possible use case. How can we prove that something is genuine? What's the anti-tamper function for voice? And not just the recording, but it could be CDRs. If a lawful intercept request is, or a data records request is put in to a service provider, how can they prove to the authorities that the CDRs they hand over are what actually came out the back of the network? What's the chain of custody, and is it provable? And so there's going to be a lot of interesting use cases, and blockchain won't be the only way of doing this. This is true of almost all use cases of blockchain. There are other approaches technologically to solve the same problems, but they may not have the same cost. They may be better. They may be more efficient in terms of use of energy, for example. Yeah, a lot of blockchain technologies at the moment aren't especially scalable. So, for example, the Bitcoin blockchain, which is probably the best known, the public blockchain has currently a transaction throughput rate per second of 7. Which is not going to really change the world in its current state. However, private blockchain technologies are very different. And I could talk for at length at the possibilities of using this as a registry for numbering, perhaps, or identity, all sorts of other use cases as well. And I think that underlying a lot of the opportunity is what we think of as a service provider is going to change here. Whether that's IoT, whether that's around wireless networks, whether it's MVNOs, virtual networks, even enterprises becoming their own service providers. This idea of we have carriers, we have ITSPs, we have cable companies. Expect another 5, 10, 100 categories of companies that call themselves service providers who will need to put communications into their products. So you might well find that you have exercise bikes as a service with real-time video. That's an actual example, where it's a communications embedded into what is a consumer product. You have the doorbells. I think I saw one on the show floor with a video camera and potentially a voice extension to a mobile app, so that you can see who's at your door while you're out, and if it's someone you trust, like the cleaner or something, you can remotely open the door and have a recording of that entire session as well. Drone as a service, coming back to what I was talking before. And so I think that we're going to start seeing new applications of embedding communication. This is also where WebRTC crops up a lot as well as being an important enabling tool for this type of application and service provider. All right, now I'm going to move on a little bit to the sort of cynical side of all this. If you speak to a lot of futurists, they will say, we don't do forecasts, we just help to create scenarios. But I'm also an analyst, so I like forecasting. I like saying this is going to happen, this is the probability, this is a curve. I'll come back to the curves in a minute. But I also do what's referred to as anti-forecasting. I try and predict what won't happen. And certainly some of the hype around blockchain would be quite high on my list of implausibilities. And there's a quote here, it's actually a fictional quote, it's Sherlock Holmes. It's like, whenever you've eliminated the impossible, whatever remains, however improbable, must be the truth. But as an industry, and that's not just open source, it's telecoms, and frankly, way beyond that in government and industry as well, is not very good at identifying the impossible and eliminating it. We are quite naturally attracted to sort of new shiny things. And it's quite difficult for us cognitively to sort of get away from our hopes and dreams of, oh, this is going to change the world, and actually stand there a bit curmudgeonly, scratch your chin and go, yeah, but no. And I think it's important to have a couple of tools to spot the impossible so we don't waste our time, effort, money, resources, skills on chasing the impossible. And I think probably top of the list of things which determine whether something is impossible or not is physics. Now, I've got a degree in physics, so I would say that. But I think there's some important things, and you're probably wondering why I've got a moose on the photo here. So we talk a lot about self-driving vehicles, and maybe we're thinking, oh, we can use remote control, we can drive things remotely, they will be driven from the cloud, we're going to be sort of decentralizing communications to and from cars or trucks. That's great, apart from the fact we have a little awkward thing called the speed of light, which rather limits the time it takes to get signals to and from data centers, particularly if they're halfway around the planet. And if you think about a vehicle moving at speed, you also have perhaps an area where you'd find a moose, not much in the way of radio coverage. And so the chances of there being gigabit speed, 1 millisecond latency, 5G networks in the middle of a forest in Oregon or Finland or wherever is probably pretty low for the next decade. So I personally would like to have the moose recognition algorithm in the vehicle, not on the cloud. And I think, frankly, I'd rather have that recognition algorithm working in microseconds rather than milliseconds as well. And so I think that sometimes, that's a little bit outside of, say, the voice and video side of things, but it ties in with perhaps some of the aspects of VR and AR. We need to start thinking a little bit more closely about constraints, whether that's on, well, battery life, I'll blame more on the chemists rather than the physicists, but indoor radio propagation is certainly one. And I think that thinking about, are we going to have the connectivity? Is it always going to perform? There's a bunch of quite hard maths when it comes to talking about quality of service as well. And I think that this should make us skeptical about some of the claims that we see. The next one is more of a sort of a situational problem. It's like, there's a famous joke about what's the best way to get to this town, and the farmer in the proverb tells you that well, if I was you, I wouldn't start from here, but we are starting from here, and so you need to think about what else are the external problems that influence what we want to do. And I think regulation is quite a topic. We have tons of rules in tons of industries that have grown up over decades or centuries. And this is a real implication when you're looking at developing communication services and apps for particular industries. So, for example, in healthcare, where you have a tension between requirement for lawful intercept, requirement for privacy, and requirement for maintaining the safety and security of patient records and data and confidentiality. It could be in an industrial context where you think, oh, it'd be really good to be able to have a video camera here, it's connected wirelessly to this point here, and you can control something. And then someone reminds you that actually having high-speed wireless and explosives on a mine or an oil field might not always be acceptable to some of the local rules and regulations. And there's a few other things as well in terms of our concept of communications as a session has served us very well for many years, and obviously the S in SIP is for session. But then you think about, well, actually, are all the future forms of communication defined by their beginning and end? Or how do we construct conversations? How do we construct ad hoc communications out of things which are sessions? Is our metaphor the right one? Can we force the way we view the world into the way we want to create applications and services in the future? And maybe you can, but you may also find that there's some obstacles as well. The other thing is inertia. it's always tempting as futurists to talk about changing the world. Yeah, everything's going to be different because of IoT. Everything's going to be different because of 5G networks. Everything's going to be different because of a new codec or whatever it is. But you end up having to deal with legacy everywhere. And I think this is also true in the voice world. Obviously, we know about migration from various existing systems. You're constrained by the resources you have, the staff you have, the expectations of existing customers and services and suppliers. And so I think you tend to find things change over time, perhaps over a longer timescales than you might hope. This is also true of AI. And I think that changing customer behavior, for example, for things like chatbots. I was talking with Dan before the call, and I'm a bit of a Luddite on some things. I don't like voice recognition technology. I don't use Siri. My Amazon Echo, frankly, is a glorified Bluetooth speaker at the moment. I came back from a trip last week with 2-3 days before I came here, and I didn't bother switching the Echo on for 2-3 days. It's not part of my life. But for other people, it will be. And it's like people who are really enthusiastic about home automation, who perhaps have kids that want to play with it. And so I think we need to understand what the dynamics there are about who does what and when. And I think we sometimes see too much enthusiasm for the pace of change in, for example, the way in which companies interact with, individuals interact with companies. So I think people still like to phone into a contact center. Yes, some people will use the web, but it takes a long, long time to change behaviors. And I think that it's very easy to just focus on the shiny thing and without recognize that there's going to be, in some cases, years or even decades long transition period. So in a way, this sort of comes back to, some of you will be familiar with one of my established rivals who talk about the hype cycle, which is actually, there's a quite famous thing called Amara's law, which is we tend to overestimate the effect of technology in the short run and underestimate it in the long run. And that is true. One of my objectives is to try to sort of get companies to try and flatten out the hype cycle. I think there's a huge amount of wasted effort and wasted money that goes into that peak and the subsequent trough. And if we can actually flatten that out and be realistic about tomorrow's problems before we get there, we could avoid that sort of waste of time and essentially compress getting to the end point. The other thing I would say is that for certain technologies, this doesn't apply. There is also what I will call the flat line of failure. Sometimes we overestimate things in the long run too, just because they're bad ideas, or they won't work because of physics or various other things. So, I'm going to conclude on a slightly more upbeat note than that. Innovation and opportunity happens at intersections, and I think really importantly, communications, whether that's voice, video, messaging, VR, collaboration, intersects with pretty much everything you can imagine. Maybe not. There's one thing I was reading about this morning, which is artificial meat. I think that's possibly one of those future trends where I'm not going to be putting it on my intersection slide anytime soon. But for most of the rest of them, I think there's probably quite a few ways we can look at. And also remember that there's multiple different dimensions here. So you can overlay AI onto this, you can overlay blockchain, and so on. That said, substitution is as important as competition. It's important for anyone who's looking at creating a product or service or innovation technology to realize there's a proliferating ways of getting to the same goal. We have a lot of options either in terms of what software we use or in terms of the ways we achieve our aim. If our aim is to satisfy a customer, we can do it via multiple different technologies in a multi-channel context. But equally, we can communicate in different ways. We might use AI to predict what something's going to be rather than actually phone people and tell them. AI might, in a way, take away some of the opportunity for communication. Maybe I'll just send if like an ambassador, an AI version of me to discuss something with James, and he can have that running locally on an edge compute server and just report back to me what it's done. And I'm using the word ambassador rather than agent there as a possibility. This will require a lot of multidisciplinary teams, a lot of new skill sets, a lot of partnering. And then there are these sort of annoying thorns of regulation and security which will crop up everywhere. And the things we need to sometimes look at what is the things which are the slowest moving parts of the chain. But overall, I would say that, particularly where you have open source platforms which allow for either greater flexibility, lower cost, and also the enthusiasm, whether that's on voice or even on the network infrastructure as well, things like the Telecom Infra project, which Facebook is sponsoring. I think that it's going to be a really interesting and exciting time as we try to combine all these different intersections over the next 5, 10, 15 years. Thank you.
Thank you. So, Disruptive Dean has run us right out of time with a great presentation, and so we don't have time for questions and answers. You need to move briskly to your next session. However, Dean, you're with us for the whole 2-3 days, aren't you?
Yeah, I'm here till tomorrow afternoon.
Look for the man in that shirt today, and maybe a different one tomorrow, and you'll be able to ask him your questions. But for now, let's say just a big thank you as we move on. Thank you very much, Dean.